leave your name and organization in the chat so we have a sense of who all is joining us for today. Well, I see a lot of folks have joined the call already. I'm sure more will still be coming in, but let's go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone, and happy Diwali to those who celebrate. Welcome to this month's Voices of the AAPI Community Briefing, where we share critical insights on the policy issues shaping our nation and our communities. My name is Sarah Sadwani. I'm a political science professor at Pomona College and a senior researcher at AAPI Data, and I'm so glad you all could join us today. We have an incredible program ahead, including the release of new data offering fresh insights into Asian American political opinions and engagement. These findings help us better understand how our communities are thinking about the issues that matter the most to all of our various organizations, from representation and voting to policy priorities and trust in institutions. I'd like to take a moment to thank our partners, AAPI Data, APIAVote, the Asian American Journalist Association, and NCAPA for collaborating on today's briefing, as well as our research partners at the Associated Press and NORC for their continued partnership in making this data possible. The Voices of AAPI briefings are such an important space, connecting data and research and lived experience to inform public understanding and policy making. I'm thrilled to welcome our speakers who we'll hear from shortly as they help us unpack the findings and discuss what they mean for the AAPI community and beyond. We have, of course, with us Manju Kulkarni, the Executive Director of AAPI Equity Alliance, Bob Sakaniwa, the Director of Policy and Advocacy from APIAVote, Greg Orton from the National Council of Asian Pacific Americans and NCAPA, and of course, last but never least, Karthik Ramakrishnan, the founder and executive director of AAPI Data. I'm going to hand it off to you first, Karthik, so you can review some of the main findings of our survey.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And hi, everyone. Thank you all for joining us and excited to share our latest findings with you. As usual, whenever we do a release, we also update some of the key findings in our running log, if you will, of key opinion data from this year. So you'll find that in the QR code. If you just go to apidata.com and go to our resource guides, you'll see a summary of data over time in 2025. And we're grateful for our partnership with the Associated Press and NORC, as well as with NCAPA, as well as with APIAVote and others, to be able to compile this data over time. Next slide. So let's dive into the findings from this latest survey. Key findings. 1, more API adults disapprove of Trump's handling of immigration now than 6 months ago. So that's a pretty significant shift, and we'll talk about that, I'm sure, in the Q&A. Second, API adults are more likely than the general public to say that Trump has gone too far when it comes to deporting immigrants living in the United States. 3, most API adults say that the economy, inflation, and jobs are extremely or very important issues to them personally. Importantly, however, only about a quarter approve of Trump's handling of each of these issues. Next slide. Next, a majority of API adults hold a favorable view of capitalism, and about a half feel the same about the progressive movement and liberalism. When it comes to socialism, and we have a prominent candidate running for mayor in New York as a democratic socialist, 44% feel favorably about that label, and smaller proportion about conservatism, and very few, only 26%, have a favorable opinion about the MAGA movement. Now, despite feeling more favorably inclined towards capitalism than socialism, when it comes to particular matters of economic regulation, 75% say the government should be responsible for ensuring affordable housing, and more say that the government can better handle lowering the cost and increasing the supply of affordable housing than the private sector. Finally, when it comes to Israel and Gaza, API adults are more likely than the general public to sympathize with Palestinians over Israelis. Next slide. So first, looking at Trump approval on issues. We see disapproval across the board. And the only issue where Trump seems to receive comparatively higher marks are on crime and immigration. And even on those, he's significantly underwater. When it comes to economic issues, you see pretty low approval. Next slide. When you look at changes in approval over time, we have 3 issues here where the question wording was exact between March of this year and September of this year. And the movements on the economy and trade negotiations, those are within the margin of error. Not so for immigration. You see disapproval on immigration and Trump's handling of immigration increased significantly from 58% in March to 71% in September. Next slide. And so, sorry, actually, so this slide is mislabeled. So this should be actually, no, this is not mislabeled, sorry. So when it comes to handling of the economy, we see significant differences by ethnicity. When it comes to Filipinos, they're less likely to disapprove of his handling of the economy when compared to Indian Americans and Vietnamese. Let's go to the next slide. We also see some differences by age where disapproval is significantly higher among those age 18 to 34 than among those 65 plus. We also see some partisan differences. Let's go to the next slide. When it comes to immigration, we also see age playing a significant role here, where disapproval is much higher among those 18 to 34 at 89%. Than among those 65 plus, but even there you see a majority disapprove his handling of immigration. We also see partisan differences. It might not be surprising to see that API Republicans support Trump's handling on immigration, but among independents, 70% disapprove. Next slide. We'll also take a deeper look at Israel-Palestine before we jump into immigration and other factors. So we see significant differences between API adults and the US population. Overall, API adults are more likely to sympathize with the Palestinians than with Israelis. So 39% for Palestinians versus 13% with Israel and 20% both equally. When you compare that to the overall US population, granted that was a few months ago, 16% with Palestinians, 26% with Israel, and 25% both equally. Let's go to the next slide. We also have differences by gender, age, and party ID, as well as by ethnicity. And you'll find all of that on our webpage. If you go to our main survey page, you will see the cross-tabulated results. But you see much stronger sympathies with the Palestinians among those 18 to 34 than among those 65 plus. You also see much stronger sympathies with the Palestinians among self-identified Democrats than among those who identify as independent or Republican. Importantly, this survey was conducted in early September before the latest round of ceasefires and agreements between Israel and Palestinians. Okay, let's go to the next slide. We also have opinion on views of providing humanitarian relief to Palestinians in Gaza, and you see some age differences and partisan differences come here as well. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so we're going to spend a lot of this briefing talking about immigration and change in opinion over time. So what we see here is opinion on where APIs stand, on whether the Trump administration has gone too far or has been about right or not gone far enough when it comes to deportations. So when it comes to deporting immigrants living in the US illegally, we find that APIs are more likely than the US average to say that the Trump administration has gone too far, 67% versus 49% overall. Interestingly, even though this is just within the margin of error for this survey as well as the other survey that AP-NORC did in September, we find that 67% of API say the Trump administration has gone too far, compared to 59% of Latinos in the United States. So that's interesting and significant, not typically what you think of, right, in terms of a constituency that is pushing back against the excesses of this administration when it comes to deportations. Next slide. Now we see partisan differences within API populations that are also there overall, but within each group, right, we see slightly higher opposition or saying that the administration has gone too far among APIs versus the US average within each party. Next slide. We also have differences by ethnicity. Filipinos among those least likely to say that the Trump administration has gone too far, with 54% expressing that opinion. Next slide. We also have comparisons over time. The first comparison is an exact wording comparison. The second one is not so, but perhaps approximate. But the key thing to see is that when it comes to favoring or opposing deporting all immigrants living in the United States illegally, we see a significant drop in support from 43% to 35% from March to September of this year. And we see an increase in opposition from 39% to 49%. So that's a pretty significant increase as far as public opinion is concerned. And it's largely due to perceived overreach by the Trump administration. Now, the second comparison is not exactly, it's not an exact match in terms of wording. In March, we, along with AP and NORC, asked about deporting all immigrants living in the United States illegally who have been convicted of a nonviolent crime such as shoplifting or burglary. We worded it that way because of legislation that was in front of Congress and ultimately passed by Congress at the time. And we saw 60% favoring that. This time around, we asked about those living in the US illegally who've been charged with misdemeanors, and we see 50%. So it's not an exact comparison, but potentially indicating drop in support for that particular kind of question. Next slide. We also asked about different government policies pertaining to deportation, asking not only about deporting all immigrants living in the US illegally, but also asking about those who've lived here for more than 10 years. Deporting those who express views that the federal government does not agree with, and those who've been charged with misdemeanors, as I just mentioned in the prior slide. And we see overall opposition to all of these policies, except for the last one, which is those who have been charged with misdemeanors, such as minor drug offenses or shoplifting. Next slide. We also asked about particular tactics. And we find significant opposition to various tactics that we've seen the administration use over the last few months, including allowing immigration enforcement agents to cover their faces when arresting people, using the military and National Guard, conducting large-scale immigration enforcement in neighborhoods with high populations of immigrants, and arresting immigrants who are in the country illegally while they are at their jobs. Let's go to the next slide. Now, this slide has a different set of questions about immigration enforcement tactics. And this comes from our API Policy Priority Survey in collaboration with NCAPA. Different question wording, but a similar theme. We see opposition to particular heavy-handed tactics by the Trump administration. Next slide. Now, looking within our community to take deeper dives that are disaggregated. Interestingly here, we don't think of Vietnamese Americans as particularly progressive on issues, but 66% of them oppose deporting immigrants living in the US illegally who express views that the federal government does not agree with. Now, is this, for the rest of the populations here, is this a glass half empty or half full? We let you decide. but there's some significant opposition across the board when it comes to this policy, with APIs at 49% overall opposing. The US deporting those living in the country illegally who express views that the federal government does not agree with. Let's go to the next slide. We also see some significant differences by age, with those 18 to 34, 68% opposed, whereas those age 65 plus, only 32 opposed and 46% supporting. Let's go to the next slide. In terms of deploying the military and National Guard, we see opposition across the board, but particularly so among those age 18 to 34, whereas those 65 plus are more split. Next slide. When it comes to allowing immigration enforcement agents to cover their faces when arresting people, again, we see a familiar age pattern here, where those 18 to 34 are very strongly opposed at 72%, whereas only among those 65 over, only 34% are strongly opposed. Next slide. Similarly, again, I don't want to repeat too much. So even though we see overall opposition, so we see 62% overall, right? 44% strongly opposed and 18% somewhat opposed to conducting large-scale immigration enforcement in neighborhoods with large immigrant populations. We see that opposition is much stronger among those 18 to 34 than among those 65 plus. Next slide. I'm going to talk a little bit about different political movements and labels, given that they may be pertinent to some elections this year, including the New York mayoral. So when it comes to different labels, we see greatest favorability for the label of capitalism, followed by the progressive movement and liberalism. Socialism, interestingly, opinion is split. So we don't see high unfavorables, 18% very unfavorable, 20% somewhat unfavorable. But we also see 30% somewhat favorable and 14% very favorable. So on net, we actually see a net favorable on socialism as a label, and perhaps most notable given that we have a mayoral candidate who is likely to win the New York mayoral as a self-described democratic socialist. Conservatism actually has greater opposition in our community than socialism does. And the MAGA movement, the Make America Great Again or MAGA movement, 55% very unfavorable, 11% somewhat unfavorable. So you combine those, 2/3 of our community have an unfavorable opinion of the MAGA movement. Next slide. There are some differences within our communities. We'll just go deeper into socialism, and we see some important differences here. Interestingly, I would have expected to see the greatest opposition among Vietnamese Americans in the survey, but we see that among Korean Americans, 29% have a very unfavorable view of the label socialism, and you see the differences with other groups there. Let's go to the next slide. We also see differences by age, and you'll see in our crosstabs, the greatest favorability for socialism is among those 18 to 34. When we look at MAGA or the Make America Great Again movement, we see stronger unfavorability among those 18 to 34 and among those who are self-identified Democrats. Next slide. Okay, this is how I wanted. We had swapped them. But on socialism, right, you see 29% among those 18 to 34, very favorable, and 35% somewhat favorable. But among those 65 plus, only 3% very favorable, 24% somewhat favorable. So age plays a huge role here, as does partisanship. Next slide. Now, despite our community having a more favorable view of capitalism rather than socialism, if you see our community's opinions on government regulation, on the economy, particularly on matters of economic relief, we actually see high levels of support for government regulation. Let's go to the next slide. So when it comes to affordable housing, by the way, in our policy priority survey that we did with NCAPA, we asked very specifically about freeze the rent, and we saw more support than opposition for that. Here we asked about affordable housing in a different manner with the Associated Press and NORC. So who do you trust more to increase the supply of affordable housing? We find that a greater proportion um, trust the government rather than the private sector in increasing the supply of affordable housing, and notably 72% among Vietnamese Americans. Again, not a constituency that we typically think of as progressive. Next slide. By the way, but we know that the Vietnamese American population are more likely to have low income adults, and so that potentially could be driving that. When it comes to the government versus the private sector increasing the supply of affordable housing, we see age and partisanship, as we saw, and other factors show a significant relationship here. Let's go to the next slide. We also asked, who do you trust more to lower housing costs? And our community trusts the government rather than the private sector more to lower housing costs. And you see some significant differences by age and by partisanship. Next slide. When it comes to government policies that provide economic relief, again, even though we might not see majority support for the socialism label, one could argue that many of these policies are indeed socialist policies: forgiving student loan debt, requiring new housing developments such as apartment buildings to include affordable housing units, capping prescription drug prices charged by drug companies, and providing free daycare and early childhood education programs for all children under 5 years old. So we see support across the board, and the strongest support is for capping prescription drug prices. Next slide. We see some differences by ethnicity and by age. I'll just highlight a few here. Support for forgiving student loan debt. We see stronger support among Vietnamese Americans and Indian Americans than for other groups. Next slide. In terms of requiring new housing developments to include affordable housing units, we see much stronger support among age 18 to 34 than those age 65 plus. Next slide. In terms of capping prescription drug prices, age is not as much of a factor and makes sense given that those who stand to benefit the most are those who are older, but we do see partisanship play a significant role here. Next slide. And then in terms of free daycare and early childhood education programs for all children under 5 years old, this has been an issue that has come up in the New York mayoral, as well as some other statewide races. We see much stronger support among those 18 to 34. Again, perhaps not surprising that they are most likely to face the burden of costs when it comes to daycare and early childhood education. But nevertheless, even among those 65 plus, if you add the strongly favor and somewhat favor, we see majority support for that policy. And even among Republicans, right, when you add 35 and 19, you get over 50% when it comes to providing free daycare and early childhood education for all children under 5 years old. Next slide. So that's some for our findings, and I'll kick it back to you, Sarah, for the panel.
Great, perfect. So thank you so much for that, Karthik. There's a lot of incredible information there. I can't wait to dig into it all. I want to ask our panelists to come back on and join us. And I'll just start it off if we can get some general reactions from the three of you. What are some of those immediate reactions? What kind of stands out to you from this data? I'd love to kind of start there, and then maybe we can dig into some of the more topical areas. Bob, do you want to lead us off?
Sure. Thanks so much. And really appreciate this opportunity to be here and have this chance to interact with our community folks and try to kind of decipher and digest all this fantastic data that we're getting, because I think this type of information is really critical, especially as we approach election season. I know it's a mini election season, but important nonetheless, given the drastic changes we've seen in federal policy and just that political space in the last 10 months here. So um, um, understanding where people are and how they're interpreting, this whiplash of policy change is vital. And clearly what I think some of these results show is that there is an extreme diversity among our community in terms of you can break it down on age, how long people have been in the country, or gender. Obviously, uh, uh, partisanship is another factor, and then, of course, the country our ancestors come from, has an impact and shows a bit of variation as well in terms of how we come out on all these issues. But I think one of the main points I take from this, I think Karthik said at the top was, you know, people are concerned, and even in the API community where there may have been support for an issue, whether it's immigration or the economy, in terms of how the president's been handling it, we've seen a consistent decline because of what everybody's seeing happen around them. And that decline is happening at different rates depending on the community or the age group you look at. But bottom line is it's moving in one direction right now. And these upcoming elections, will give us at least a beginning of a sense of how it plays out electorally. But that's kind of my initial thoughts here.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's right. I mean, I think we're definitely seeing significant movement even from what we were looking at earlier this spring, for sure, with this data. Manju, initial reactions to this data?
Sure. And thank you for having me on. It's great to join you, Karthik, Bob, and Greg, and happy Diwali to everyone. Um, what it says to me, actually, and I'm hopeful in this way that, our community is not necessarily as conservative as, some of us have thought. Um, and, something that Garthik has said over the years is that we are a community that moves, that we are responsive to policies. And so we're not necessarily solidly in one camp or the other. And so what you see here, as Karthik himself said, is overreach, right? So our community responding to the overreach that they are seeing by the Trump administration. So while some support deportations and detentions, and immigration enforcement more generally, where they have seen it become more authoritarian and more problematic, they have said, whoa, let's not engage that way, right? And so that's a hopeful sign for me.
Yeah, great. I mean, certainly the data showing that the term conservative, the label conservatism had a greater unfavorability than socialism certainly came as an eye-opener for me. And I can't wait to kind of break that down and look more into it. Greg, initial reactions from you as well on this data?
Yeah, hey everybody. It's good to be with you as always. I agree with what my colleagues have been saying, and I think for me personally, I find myself reflecting on the fact that we have been having these kind of conversations about survey data, and we've been committed and sort of intentional with doing surveys around some of these questions over the last few months. And it's the shifts over time that are really starting to stand out to me, right? We always knew that there's going to be some lag and some delay in public perception of how people are feeling and internalizing the policy changes that are being made in DC. But to me, this really speaks out to just our community is not ignoring what's happening in some ways, especially on the immigration side. It really stands out that such a majority of our community is saying, you know what, this has gone way too far. I agree with Manju that it gives me a little bit of hope that when our community, the moral compass of our community is on point, or at least aligned with where we're hoping to go, which is, we need to have a functioning immigration system, and this sort of, you know, sensationalized approach of creating headlines and creating narratives and creating, frankly, at times propaganda, it's hurting everyday people, and it's not something that's resonating with our community. And so I don't know if obviously these survey data really moves to decision makers in the White House, but it does give me some encouragement that our community is at least acknowledging this and frankly saying pretty openly that we reject these approaches to immigration enforcement.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Well, since we're on this topic of immigration enforcement already, I think this is a big piece that came out. I definitely want to get into some of the labels and most certainly economy and inflation, but let's maybe start with immigration. And just for everybody who is on the webinar, please feel free to drop your questions into the Q&A box. We are keeping an eye on that, and we will try to respond to all of the questions that get dropped there. But Manju, maybe we can come back to you thinking a little bit more about these numbers. This approval for Trump's immigration handling has dropped significantly from 42% in March of 2025. I remember when those numbers came out, and I think it came as quite a shock to many people to see the support level for deportations. But we've seen this stunning drop from 42% in March to 29% now in this current survey. What do you think is accounting for this shift in the AAPI opinion around immigration policies, particularly seeing some of the shifts or the differential between Asian Americans and Latinos? It looked like Asian Americans were even more concerned than Latino or Hispanic communities. So what do you think accounts for it? And then also in your role at AAPI Equity Alliance, can you perhaps speak to the impact that the June deployment of the National Guard in Los Angeles, where you are there on the ground, what impact did that have, do you think, on public opinion around immigration?
Sure. So I'll take them one by one. Thanks for your question, Sarah. I think it's very simply the news accounts. Many in our community watch the news, still watch network news. They read local newspapers as well as national. And so I think it's those news accounts that have really led to this shift. Seeing, grandmothers picked up, children, seeing the violence by ICE agents. You have masked men literally beating up clergy, seniors, officials like Senator Padilla and Brad Lander, the controller in New York City, manhandling the disabled. So I think that, and many in our community remember that from the homeland, right? Seeing police violence, and that's what it is. And so, those particular pieces, keeping people, from their workplace, from school. And I want to say, specifically about what happened in Los Angeles, I think it was a combination of the ICE raids and the military occupation, understanding for those of us in LA that it was unnecessary, right? You could very easily walk down the street anywhere, including in downtown, right? There was not the type of violence or mayhem that was suggested by President Trump or by, GOP members of Congress. And I think, what we need to be clear about is there is an effort, and even folks like Mayor Bass have said this, there's an effort to enrage young people, especially those who are impacted, whose family members have been deported, to justify the military action, right? So that's why you bring these troops in, you seek to enrage them, and then you use it when they do get enraged to justify police violence against brown and black folks. I mean, we've seen this through the course of American history. What I think it's led to is tremendous amount of fear in our communities, even in AAPI communities. I've heard from friends who are attorneys who've said that, even business owners in Little India have asked, should I carry my passport? Should I carry other documents? These are, typically middle class, even upper middle class individuals who are nervous. I've heard many in the Indian community specifically, including even, my cousin in Atlanta, Georgia, say that at their Diwali party, people were talking about getting OCI cards. They are talking about Plan B, which is to leave the United States. That is how serious this is for a lot of folks, and not only those in the South Asian community. And of course, at its worst, it's about not leaving home, not going to work, not going to school, not going to social events because you're so afraid. The last thing I'll say, which is about younger folks, and those differences, it's not at all surprising that nativity makes a difference in attitude. Unfortunately, a number of more recent immigrants, especially those with status, will say, well, we entered the right way, right? Not understanding the challenges faced by undocumented folks, others, who are on TPS or other things. And that's even true when it comes to race, on LGBTQ issues. New immigrants often bring sort of attitudes and beliefs from the homeland, which would be different than what we necessarily believe here. And they haven't experienced it. They have not experienced racism the way those of us who are born and raised here have. What they believe in, the mythology of America, essentially, what they've seen in Hollywood movies. They believe in American exceptionalism, which I think has now been debunked. And they believe, sadly, in anti-Black attitudes, racial hierarchy. I'll just end with, something that Toni Morrison said, which is the immigrant experience is to come to the United States and to believe in the racial ladder, and that African Americans are and Latinos really are at the bottom and white folks are at the top. And unfortunately, and especially in AAPI communities, there's a individuals seeking white adjacency, and that if they believe and hold these attitudes and do things, quote, the right way, the Andrew Yang way, that they will somehow be immune or invulnerable. And I think what's happening now has shown that to be false.
Thank you. Oh, yeah, Bob, do you want to jump in on this one? Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up because Manju brought up so many good points here. But I think, what we have to remember is this administration, internally is fighting between what it wants to do for its corporate friends and businesses versus the kind of Stephen Miller Bannon element of the Great Replacement theory and wanting to, get all people of color out of this country. And I think, part of their approach works when, as Manju said, people are thinking they want to just leave on their own. That's a form of self-deportation because they're trying to raise the heat on, being here, even if you're here with documentation, and it's still uncomfortable. And I think we saw in the Hyundai raid, we see with the H-1B fee effort that they're trying to cut off all avenues of immigration into this country. So I think the reaction that people need to have is we're not going to get pushed out, and whether we're here without all our papers or whether we're here because we did stand in line, it doesn't matter because the opposition doesn't care, and their enforcement mechanisms and enforcement approach shows that they don't care. Their ProPublica report just came out showing how many U.S. citizens have been swept up in all these actions. We're not even talking about green card holders who, again, quote unquote, did it the right way. We're talking about American citizens. And if they can get swept up because of the way they look or the accent they have, we're all in trouble. So it's definitely something I feel is opening our community's eyes to what's really going on, and reflects what we saw, in that trend that, again, Karthik brought up at the top.
Well, I'm wondering if we can drill down on that just a little bit more, because I mean, some of the numbers that we are seeing are pretty stunning, right? 51% view the progressive movement favorably, 44% view socialism favorably, while only 26 view the MAGA movement favorably. What does this suggest? I mean, is this a change? Is it just the complexity of things? Is it just the moment, or do you anticipate in the future things will shift again? And then, given your role, maybe Bob, we can start with you. Given your role at APIAVote, how do you think we can leverage, or how do you think your organization might leverage this data and this information to better engage AAPI voters? What do you anticipate that that's going to look like?
I mean, I think it really underscores, like these are concepts, really, capitalism, socialism, and they can be associated with, positive or negative things, but generally in this country, especially among immigrants who are coming here from abroad, that the notion that this is the land of opportunity, that's about capitalism, and maybe they're coming from a country where, communism, or which is of course associated with authoritarian forms of government, is, sounds a lot like socialism in terms of just how it hits your, how it hits the ears. But the reality is, people, I think this survey shows people are looking beyond these labels, and understanding that, that government does have a role, whether it's helping with housing costs, helping with inflation, all these things. Our current shutdown right now, which is essentially the hangover we're dealing with from the big beautiful bill, is based on healthcare and people's healthcare needs and costs. So I think people are able to look beyond just the connotations of the label like socialism, and say, yeah, that's what we need government to be engaged and helping us in. And I hopefully, New York City will kind of help lead the rest of the nation in understanding, what these terms really mean.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And you start to already kind of transition us to talking about the economy and some of those core kitchen table issues that we know have been on the minds of Americans far and wide for quite some time, especially since we've seen such incredible inflation over the last several years. I want to maybe transition just a little bit to talk a little bit more specifically about the economy and inflation. Those are issues that we see in this data are very important to Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. Yet only about a quarter approve of Trump's handling of those issues. And that's in line with other surveys that we've seen. So Greg, I want to pull you into the conversation. In this political moment and the government shutdown, Bob already started talking about it. How can we translate some of this data into effective messaging, do you think, about the current administration and making the voices of APIs heard? How do we begin to do that? Do you have thoughts on that?
So I'd say first, I'll leave it to the statisticians to either confirm or deny, but I feel like anytime you see 92% or 89%, that's like the equivalent of screaming at the top of your lungs. And I think it just reflects just how much concern there is in our community about the state of the economy, about their financial well-being, about how they can support their families. And the fact that only 25% approve, like that is a massive discrepancy and gap. And I think that only gets worse as long as the shutdown continues. And I appreciate Bob sort of laying out the broader context for why the shutdown has happened. I agree with everything he said as far as this is about healthcare. This is about your healthcare too, and sort of watching your healthcare premiums either increase, or some of our community members will lose healthcare access entirely. And that's not a good thing. I think that's such a common sense thing to say when we think about it in our personal lives. But when you think about it across the community, it is not helpful to have people who are not able to work because they're sick. It's not helpful to have a healthcare system that's not being funded properly, and then suddenly more and more people are getting sick as well. So I think there's some real questions that members of Congress are grappling with. Certainly, the White House appears to be grappling with it in a slightly different way or slightly different approach in terms of how they want to solve for it. I want to be careful and not get myself and my colleagues in trouble and sort of commenting too much on sort of the partisan nature of this. But the reality is that we're shut down because Democrats want to extend healthcare subsidies for some of the poorest people in our country. And there are people who disagree and they can't seem to find an agreement. And it's a question of who blinks first. But I will say more, in a broader context, the shutdown the economy will shrink. It'll contract as long as the government is shut down. That is not good for any of us. Like the trickle down effects further downstream on companies and the American economy will be felt. It will be felt over time. And so the longer this shutdown continues, the more likely it'll be that a lot of the potential either revenue or payroll or economic growth that would have been otherwise happening will not be made up. Oftentimes, federal workers will get paid for during their time on furlough. But the longer that goes, and certainly the longer that there are contractors or other American small businesses that rely on a functioning federal government, there's no guarantee that they will make up some of those, some of that economic gain. And I don't know what that means for our community entirely, other than historically speaking, when shutdowns have gone on for an extended period of time, it has hurt economic growth, and that's not something that I believe the Trump administration wants. But I, I I'm not sure why they continue sort of forging down this path, other than sort of an ideological bet or sort of crusade that they're on, and that is concerning as well as obviously harmful for our community. As far as making our voice heard, it is true. It feels like in many ways there's less that we can do as a community to affect change. But all I can say is encouraging every single person on this webinar to think about what role we can all play going into next year. And again, not telling people how to vote, but simply getting people to vote and connecting with groups like Bob's with APIAVote to mobilize. We have to get our people out there to make sure that we're heard. Politicians respond to pressure, and it's on us to create that pressure. I would maybe turn it back to Bob to give some thoughts into how you all are setting yourselves up for next year. But I can say for NCAPA, for many of our members, we're already starting those conversations because that is the first step to sort of turning this very big ship that we're all
on. Bob, you're welcome to answer that if you'd like. I also just want to point out there's been a couple of questions in the Q&A specifically about New York as well. And I think as we're talking both about these kind of kitchen table issues, the economy issues, as well as some of these labels around capitalism and socialism, both are completely relevant in the New York mayoral election. And obviously this is one of those elections where people can get excited and go make their voice heard this year. Karthik, I'm assuming that we don't have a specific pullout on New York City data.
Yeah. So we don't have enough sample size with this survey for New York State or even New York City. But what I would say is that it's important to try to triangulate different types of information, and we saw some exit poll data coming out of the primary as well. And I'll go back to, it's kind of touching on what Manju said, but in some ways kind of maybe referring back to what I've been saying all along, which is, our community is dynamic. So these are election specific things. Sometimes there may be local issues that might not necessarily translate into what will happen in a presidential election or even in the midterms. But sometimes there's like patterns and trends that are happening. Trump certainly is playing a role in the extent to which this administration is overplaying its hand on immigration. You're seeing a dynamism in our community on that issue. But even something like Mamdani, what that look like pre-primary to now post-primary is probably quite different. And when we asked in our policy priority survey about, people's opinions about quote unquote freezing the rent in high cost of living cities, we saw support for that. And so that's something that I think there's evidence we can see from this survey as well as the policy priority survey that all point to Mamdani maybe not being that far off from where a majority of the community is, and not just say South Asians, but Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders more generally. And I think that's going to be some huge implications for our community. What are community leaders and maybe even party leaders, say Democratic Party leaders, going to do after the general election and the mayoral? Huge implications for youth, I think, engagement as well. We know that midterms tend to be low turnout elections for API communities and for young people, including young API people in particular. We saw an exception to that in 2018 when Trump ended up energizing a lot of people in opposition. We also saw that hate incidents and hate crimes had a mobilizing effect in 22. What's going to happen in 26? I think a lot is going to hinge on how people react to the kinds of political formations and the increasing evidence that's piling up that affordability and taking bolder stances on issues might actually be an electorally winning strategy.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with you on that, Karthik. I think, 2025 is obviously always, this kind of off-cycle election always is that opportunity to have a litmus test of where we are going. We, in addition to New York City mayor, we of course also have New Jersey governor, Virginia governor. We have Prop 50 here in California. So there's a lot of folks who are going to be voting, and I think that'll be really telling, particularly for the Democratic Party, and as they seem to continue to grapple with the identity crisis that they've been in. Bob, I know you were potentially wanting to get back into this conversation, maybe Manju as well.
And I was just going to say real quickly that with those two statewide elections coming up in New Jersey and here next to DC and Virginia, I did want to just say real quick that part of our effort working with our partners in those states, partners like Homke Center and SOLDEF, as well as API New Jersey, it's just simply getting out the vote. And in that effort, Karina Salvi from our organization, she posted further up in the chat, information on how you can get involved with phone banking in those states if you're interested. And if you just click the link, it'll show you where to go and how to get involved in that sort of get out the vote activity. It's nonpartisan. It's not about a message, any other message other than please go out and vote, because that's how we're going to really see, these survey numbers and survey data actually play out. Even though, next year's the big midterm, we really want to get a sense of where our communities are at. And I think New Jersey and Virginia will give us a real head start in that.
Absolutely. Manju?
Yeah, I just wanted to say a few things about Mamdani. An interesting anecdote is that Fox played an entire interview, I believe, with Mamdani, and in the comment, looking to, garner a lot of opposition to him, among their audience. And actually a number of comments, several were, if this is, socialism, sign me up. So I think it speaks to the fact that, people hear labels, but what they want and what they wanted in the 2024 election was affordability, dealing with inflation, housing issues. And these are what Mamdani has spoken to. And he has even spoken to many who were Trump voters. And I think that's what's also key for our both our electeds as well as for candidates is, I expect there to be within our community and outside a lot of defectors. And that's what's important as we seek to fight authoritarianism. I did want to also just say that, not only is there a significant South Asian population in New York, but I believe the Muslim population is equivalent to the Jewish population, which, while many people have thought of New York as a city with a significant Jewish population, as it has been, the fact that the Muslim population, and of course, we know that most Muslims in America are actually from some part of Asia. I think that's notable. So those are, I think, a couple of the demographic shifts that we've seen there, and I think that are important in terms of what we expect to be his success in
Yeah,
November.
one thing I'll add to that, Manju, just on the demographics, and who knows what kind of stories will be told and the analyses, but the Bangladeshi American community, right? So when you look at, when you think of the South Asian population, Indian Americans kind of loom large as the largest population. But if you look at the concentration of Bangladeshi Americans in New York City and New York Metro more generally, I mean, that I think will be an important story to tell about the activation of that community. There was only one time, I mean, it's so expensive to do these surveys and to be able to survey in language with smaller populations. But in the 2016 National Asian American Survey, I used to say that Indian Americans are among the most progressive among Asian American groups. And like Bangladeshis are like, hold my drink, like they are even more progressive. And so we were able to do that for the first time ever. So hopefully, we'll start seeing, deeper stories about different Asian American groups in New York City and to pay attention, to see this as their political moment as well.
Yeah. I think that's, Manju, did you want to respond to that?
No, I just said exactly.
Yeah, exactly from all of us. I think this is, of course, absolutely a moment where we're going to be hearing a lot of stories of Asian American communities and their importance in the vote from New York City and this mayoral race that we've been talking about, but also, of course, a large AAPI community in New Jersey, as well as in those Northern Virginia areas. So I think we're going to be hearing a whole lot from the AAPI community in the coming weeks before this election. And no doubt this data is going to be an important part of that story. So I want to thank all of our partners for their participation in ensuring that we are getting the data out on the AAPI community. And thanks to everyone who joined in today for your engagement and for your participation in today's briefing. You can continue to stay up to date on our latest findings at AAPI Data and the AP-NORC websites. And of course, as always, feel free to reach out with any questions. This has been a fantastic briefing. So many thanks, of course, to Karthik for providing this data and creating this space, and for Bob, Manju, and Greg for all of your insights on the importance of this data and the ways in which it might be impacting us. Thanks so much, everybody, and we will see you next time.